Good afternoon, everybody, again. Thanks so much for coming over to this session. It's my great pleasure indeed to introduce Kara, who's going to speak about the world of mobility metrics in an evolving privacy-aware world. Just a little bit of background. Kara and I have been friends for many years. Kara is one of those unique individuals with a combination of skills you rarely find. She has legal skills, she knows her way around privacy, and she knows location intelligence inside out. A perfect combination. Kara, it's all yours.
Thank you, Arthur. And first, I want to say it is an honor and a privilege to have been invited to speak at this Location Intelligence Knowledge Exchange Canada 2022. It seems like just yesterday that we were at Ryerson in person talking about location intelligence. And I look forward to the day sometime very soon in the future where we can all meet again in person. Today, I'm going to be talking about mobility metrics in an evolving privacy-aware world. And first, I want to start out with a little intro to mobility metrics. What are they? What am I talking about here? This is the world of Streetlight data. Streetlight data creates transportation analytics that look at the patterns and movement of groups of people, not individuals, not individual behavior, not things in real time. And these are very important distinctions when you consider the types of data that are available and the constraints in certain use cases as compared to others. Here I show three pillars or three slides, and I like to frame this as the three stages in what we do at Streetlight. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go through at a high level what it is that Streetlight is doing. And then I'm going to put this against the backdrop of an emerging privacy landscape. First of all, Streetlight ingests millions and millions and millions of location records every month. These input records come from LBS sources, GPS sources, and contextual data. Location-based services data consists of things like information that comes from apps from your phone. GPS data may be an in-vehicle navigation system that does routing in your car, or maybe in a connected truck that has some sort of mobility pattern tracking over time. These location sources, GPS sources, are also combined more recently with other sensor data, and this may be things like traffic counters. In addition, we also use a lot of contextual data. Contextual data consists of things like the census or points of interest, and then, of course, the more traditional sources that we're all aware of, road, rail, and bus networks. That's the input. Now, this input all goes into Streetlight, where we process these many, many, many location records and transform it into multimodal travel patterns. If I rewind to the beginning of Streetlight, it was at a time when we were very focused on looking at core mobility patterns. For example, mobility patterns related to people driving in cars or trucks. But nowadays, with all of the mode shifting, thoughts and considerations about climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, trying to move cars off the road, trying to get people to use other modes of transportation, we found that it was very important to start diversifying. So now our metrics are looking at cars, trucks, bus, rail, bicycle, and pedestrians. And this reflects the reality of the kind of environment, the emerging environment that we're living in. These process metrics are output in the form of aggregate metrics about composite groups of people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The metrics are available through the software as a service platform called Streetlight Insight. And with that high-level overview, I'm next going to go on to the behind the scenes. How does this work from a privacy point of view? Through the lens of privacy, how do we actually operationalize this in the business? And for any of you who attended my presentation a couple of years ago at Ryerson, this slide is familiar to you with a few small changes. Going back to the 3 stages or pillars that I talked about in my last slide, the first consideration is the supplier input data, the location data. All kinds of location data have all kinds of interesting anomalies, use-based consents. And we will always start with supplier questionnaires and evaluations. If you want to be a supplier to Streetlight, you have to fill out questionnaires and go through what we call third-party risk assessments. We do evaluations of data, and we look carefully at the individual privacy policies and terms of use of location suppliers. And from this, and over the years, we've been able to set what I call a minimum baseline. And this minimum baseline has set things so that we only license a subset of data. Only the data that we absolutely need to process our metrics. And I think this is a very important thing globally to consider in this emerging privacy landscape. Just because that data is there doesn't mean that you have to access it, or even that you have to collect it in the first place. But you certainly don't need to keep it around unless you really need it. In this minimum baseline, we will secure only a minimum number of fields like latitude, longitude, timestamp, provider ID, accuracy flag, and some sort of unique identifier. But the unique identifier is very important, not going to be the advertising identifier. It's going to be something else. And it may be something that is partner specific. So for example, if Streetlight gets an ID for a particular device, that ID may not match the ID that goes to another party in the value chain. And that is one of the ways to prevent cross-pollination in the location data supply. We also rely on contractual reps and warranties, and the representations are statements about, this is what I'm telling you the state of things are right now. We represent that we have the necessary rights and permissions and consents. And this is very important when you're working in the location space, that your partners are able to stand behind this and say, we do have the necessary permissions. And to also provide warranties. Warranties being, and in the future, we also say that we will make sure that we have the necessary rights, permissions, and consents. I think that these contractual reps and warranties are becoming even more important as the landscape evolves. In addition, we do check-ins and reassessments with our suppliers. And we also expect that if there are changes in the data feed that are being anticipated because of new laws or new best practices, these are things that we want to know about so that we can anticipate these changes and make the necessary adjustments in our products. And the last point to emphasize in supplier input is that data is not real time. This is a very important thing. Streetlight is not in the business of providing real-time coupons or rider data to people. The data is always non-real time or archival. Second, when the data comes in the door, we rehash the records. This is important because it breaks the original link between the data that we got from the supplier and what we're doing with it inside. and then multiple levels of security. And very important, we break location data records into pieces. Everything we do is based on probability distributions. One example, the way to think about this is we would not say device 123 lives at this particular location. What we would say is that this particular device has a 60% chance that it lives in this zip code, a 30% chance that it lives in the second zip code, and a 20% chance that it lives in the third zip code. And that, I think that equals 100%. Anyway, so these all contribute to probability distributions. And you can think of this as composite persons or composite groups of people. Now, moving forward in terms of the processing that we're doing, there's something that happens behind the scenes within our web app, and that is called automated privacy and coverage checks. Anything that goes through our web app has this privacy and coverage check that goes on behind the scenes that looks at things like, is this residential or is it commercial? What is the size of the zone or the area that someone is trying to analyze? And what is the sample size? Because what we want to be considerate about and think about all the time is potential for re-identification. Re-identification is, of course, a no-no. And therefore, the de-identification techniques, first of all, in our supplier input, and then second of all, the ongoing de-identification that Streetlight does is also very important. Any analyses that are flagged under our automated privacy and coverage checks go to humans. They go to members of our support team who are specially trained to deal with these analyses. Sometimes it's a matter of a user just forgot to draw the polygon correctly, or they put the location in the wrong place. Or it could be something where they forgot to put a gate showing which area they wanted the traffic to actually be passing through. So it catches all sorts of quality related things in addition to the primary purpose, and that is to make sure that we have sufficient sample size to prevent the re-identification of individuals. And that is one of the examples of the multi-step and multi-layered de-identification and anonymization that Streetlight does to continue to protect the data. In addition, we provide training for our employees, and we also have some asset mapping tools. For any of you working in the privacy world, you know that there are a whole host of tools out there to help you in data mapping and other requirements to keep track of the data that you're using in-house. And moving over to the output, this is the output that the customers see. The customers receive metrics. They're aggregate metrics about composite groups of people, never about individuals. And going back to the contractual safeguards that I mentioned in terms of what we expect from our suppliers, we also have to provide those contractual safeguards to our customers and say, we have the necessary rights, permissions, and consents to be able to provide these metrics to you. On the other side of that, we also expect our customers and users to contractually agree that they're not going to use our metrics with other materials to try to re-identify individuals. And this is done both in our contracts and also if you are a user of the web app. The first time you go into your account, you will see a notice where you're put on notice that you have important obligations to continue to protect location data. And then finally, one other emerging aspect is encouraging customers to get involved. privacy is a shared responsibility, whether you are an engineer, a data scientist, a politician, a CEO. This is not anymore just the privacy team is going to go in there and create a whole bunch of overhead and paperwork. Everyone has some responsibility. And there are some emerging activities happening right now that are very important. One of them is the Civic Privacy Leaders Network, and there are also a number of best practices and templates available. If anyone would like more information about how to get more involved, best practices and templates and what's available, please contact me after the session. My contact information is at the end of my presentation. And now I'm going to move on to some time-based evolving events that are really changing things and shaking things up in the location industry. And this is, of course, against the backdrop of the global pandemic and all kinds of considerations about climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, social equity, all of the things that this group has been talking about over the last 4 weeks. There are at least four external factors that are impacting businesses that use location data. And for any of you working in the location data space now, you will understand and probably agree that there is some impact to your business based on one or all of these four factors. The first is public expectations. Public expectations related to privacy are changing. Every week, we see media coverage talking about location data actors that doing the wrong thing, brokers selling data, the government getting access, and perhaps there's scope creep in what government might be doing. And there's a lot of media coverage, a lot of gotcha stories. Now, there are actual harms and there are potential harms. And I think it's very important to try to distinguish between the actual and the potential harms and to not lump everyone in the location space into one bucket. Because as you will see later, when I walk through a few use cases, these are societally important use cases that I believe are possible to do, provided that you are handling and using location data in privacy respecting and privacy forward ways. The second area where public expectations are changing are the consumer. The reasonable expectations of the consumer are changing. People are becoming privacy aware. They want to take control of their privacy. That it is now 24/7, we're connected to everything, and people are waking up and saying, wait a minute, okay, do I have to trade my for all of this? And can I actually maintain some control over my privacy? Third, government access and use of commercial data. I mentioned that briefly a few minutes ago, but I wanted to mention something important, and that is traditionally we've had these silos of commercial data and government access. And in the US, for example, the press has recently been disclosing that in some cases, government has gone to commercial data suppliers and directly licensed data without going through the normal procedures of getting a search warrant, a valid subpoena, and so on. And there are some activities in the US right now to try to plug up that back door. I think it's important to think from the point of view of a reasonable consumer here. Would a reasonable consumer think that when they clicked, yes, I agree, and they want to use a particular app, were they thinking that their data was also going to go to law enforcement, national security, and so on? And is it buried somewhere in the text of the user consent? And then fourth, all of this has garnered a lot more attention from lawmakers and enforcement agencies. And this is in the US, this is in Canada, and of course, across the world. The second external factor is the dynamic legislative environment. Here in Canada, we have the new Quebec privacy law that is being rolled out over a 3-year period, and proposed modernization of privacy laws at the federal level with PIPEDA, Ontario, BC, and Alberta. And what we're seeing is that Canada is moving from an ombudsman model to perhaps more of an enforcement model. And this is evident in the Quebec privacy law and these proposed modernizations that are being put forward in all of the locations I mentioned, and others as well. South of the border, we have 3 comprehensive privacy laws that have passed since 2019. That would be Virginia, Colorado, and California. And it doesn't stop there. We have another state that's very close, and 29 comprehensive state privacy bills were introduced in the last session of Congress. And now in the new session of Congress, many, many more. And then at the federal level, more than 12 privacy bills introduced in Congress. In summary, there's a lot going on in terms of legislation that will have an impact on the location ecosystem. I think directly for companies that are collecting location data, and also for companies like Streetlight that are using location data for very important use cases. The third category of external factors is technological challenges. Apple and Google have made a series of changes over time to give users more control over the collection and use of location data, requirements for transparency, more granular notices, and essentially moving into an opt-in consent model. This trend is going to continue. And one of the things that these technological changes have done is they have triggered somewhat some of the industry volatility that I call the fourth external factor. In response to the legislative changes, the technical changes, location data companies are either disappearing, restructuring, rebranding, getting gobbled up, or moving to shifting business models. So for example, if you were a data broker 1 year ago, maybe you don't want to be a data broker anymore. And instead of being a data broker, maybe you become a provider of a data portal or a marketplace where the data is confined within your environment. And when people want to ask questions about the data, they inquire into your universe or your lake of data rather than allowing the feeds of data going out the door. In summary, these are very important external factors that are impacting on the business, on location businesses in general. So how do you respond to these sorts of things? I think in terms of public expectations, it's very important to continue to educate about the importance of context, the importance of use cases. Reasonable consumer expectations differ. For example, when a consumer is aware that the data is being used to figure out where to put new bike lanes in or new pedestrian paths, as compared to maybe brokering of data to create a profile of you, or even audience attribution, direct marketing. So the context and the use cases are very important, and therefore separating fact from fiction and continuing to educate people, whether it's the media, the lawmakers, the enforcement agencies, about what's really going on. And the second, in terms of legislative activity, I think that it's a combination of wait and see, but also making sure that your voice is heard. For example, if you're going to get swept up in unintended consequences based on legislative activity, it's worth speaking up. The technological changes, these are things that Streetlight anticipated for a while. And I think that companies need to be able to respond and take it at face value that we are in an opt-in regime now. Opt-in consent, not opt-out. And companies that are not willing to adjust to those requirements are not going to survive. And then in terms of industry volatility, I think here it's important to look at diversification of data supply. What other kinds of data could we start using in the future that maybe don't raise the same sorts of issues? And then consider different methodologies, for example, to allow for your company to be able to access data feeds in a data portal or a data marketplace environment where the data is more processed. And with that, I'm just now going to move on to some of the use cases that Streetlight and other mobility analytics providers are able to support. Transportation planning is the first obvious category. Traffic engineering and operations, safety and active transportation, and then smart cities and new mobility. More recently, I've seen a big focus and shift on looking at EV infrastructure planning, looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and being able to measure greenhouse gas emissions based on empirical evidence, and also vehicle miles and vehicle kilometers traveled. In light of our global pandemic, there's been a lot of work that's been done looking at the trends and changes over time in travel of vehicles and distances and destinations. Then ride-hailing and delivery studies. These are in the new reality of Uber and Lyft and ride sharing. And then, of course, very important, supporting social equity and planning for connected vehicles. When I say connected vehicles, well, that could be autonomous driving, or here, this also could be related to figuring out where to put the nodes for flying taxis in the future. And finally, what I'd like to do now is just run through a few use cases. And these are some of the more recent use cases that we've been involved in. The first one is optimizing bus schedules to serve changing commuting patterns. And this was something that was taking place at the height of COVID. Samtrans is the Bay Area Public Transit Agency, and they needed to respond to shifts in commuting patterns. They couldn't figure out why ridership on one of the most popular express bus routes to San Francisco had dropped disproportionately versus other modes. And what they did was they looked at what we call origins and destination metrics that look at the composite origins and destinations of populations. And you can think of this as showing up as a giant heat map to understand commuter travel patterns and to look at things like, well, people are driving into the city, but they're not staying very long. They're maybe just popping into their office to get something, or maybe they're just doing a quick shopping trip, but the stays are much shorter. And then also noticing that just the ridership was severely going down by certain times of day and days of week. And what they were able to do was look at these shifting travel patterns and fine tune the bus schedule, which actually ended up in boosting their ridership by 30%. all of this was not possible without the use of location data. The second example is Windsor, Ontario. And Windsor, Ontario has had a legacy transit route system for a long time. After 20 years of budget constraints, they needed an overhaul, and the planners needed to prioritize routes. Streetlight was able to play an important role in this in conjunction with one of our architecture and engineering partners, Dillon Consulting. What Dillon was able to do was confirm that the downtown was not a top destination during peak travel periods anymore. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a heat map here. And this is what I was talking about, how the metrics show up as heat maps. Planners were able to develop new routes based on crosstown travel and determine budget needs for the future. Also, another societally important use case, not possible without the use of location data. And the third use case is transit planning in Toronto. For any of you who live in the GTA, you know that transit infrastructure is greatly needed. And what Toronto needed were projections and estimates for the demand of the new transit infrastructure, connecting neighborhoods in the suburbs to the urban core. And what we were able to do with the Streetlight Insight platform, or I should say, what Toronto was able to do was to model the potential impact that certain transit locations and routes could have on mitigating personal and commercial congestion. In other words, taking cars off the road, which would, of course, make travel on the Don Valley Parkway maybe bearable someday, and on connecting neighborhoods with key activity centers. Also not possible without the use of location data. And now, this is a bike and pedestrian safety study for an equitable city. This was City of Pittsburgh deploying initiatives to make the city safer, pedestrians and bicycles. And here they had many, many challenges. And across the US and Canada, these are the kinds of challenges that cities and municipalities are facing right now. Barriers in terms of topography, space. There are requirements for on-street parking. Until we get the cars off the road, people still need places to park. And in Pittsburgh, there's very odd geometry. And what they were able to do was to help pinpoint where traffic-related crashes were occurring. And this was using our bicycle and pedestrian origin and destination metrics. I think one of the most interesting findings from this is that with the overlay of city crash data, the unexpected insight was that the most severe crashes were occurring in areas with lower bike and pedestrian traffic, which begs the question, how do you explain that, and how do you mitigate and improve that for the future? Another use case not possible without the use of location data. And then finally, one other use case, and this is Twin Cities MPO, or Municipal Planning Organization. The officials had to measure emission sources and changes over time, but they didn't have specific information from their locations. What they were doing previously is they were calculating based solely on traffic volumes. Very interesting way to do things, but it was leading to skewed results because emissions were being overcounted in small communities that were intersecting the highways. So simply because these small communities were intersecting highways, they were showing overly emitting emissions. Well, these were skewed results. And what the MPO was able to do was to actually look at the origins and destination, the volume of traffic for commercial versus personal vehicles, determining the vehicle miles traveled for each pair of origin and destination area, calculate the transportation immediate emissions for those, and combine those with vehicle emission rates. And then the council made this available online to the public, and planners were able to quantify vehicle emissions and select emissions reduction strategies. I think this is the trend that we are going to see in terms of uses of location data going forward. And with that, I would like to close by saying thank you very much. I am eager to take your questions. And what I've done in my presentation is I have provided a number of additional use case examples that are available for the audience to view afterwards. And please contact me or my colleagues at Streetlight to answer any of your questions. And with that, I turn it back to you, Arthur.
All righty. Thank you very much, Kara. That was brilliant. There are questions. I have to admit that they're all from me, but I still think they're good questions. So let me start with the first one, and I got a little loquacious with this one, but real estate giants are starting to take over some of the location intelligence companies so that they can consume the services for their own exclusive use. So that sort of sets up a thematic convergence, which I'm suspecting might lead us in the space of more location intelligence startups, and perhaps even startups that are very disciplined in the direction that they take, like, for example, climate change. Any thoughts on that?
I, first of all, agree that there is a lot of conglomeration and takeover, for example, maybe by real estate. Or you look in the case of, for example, Streetlight was acquired by Jacobs Engineering just 1 month ago. That is a large publicly traded company, architecture and engineering firm that saw a lot of value in combining the Streetlight analytics and metrics with what they're doing in their world. But that doesn't mean that Streetlight is not going to continue to support all the other architecture and engineering firms in the world. And it certainly doesn't mean that we won't support real estate conglomerates and development companies as well. And I do think that we will see more niche startups that are building upon the experience, for example, of Streetlight and saying, okay, what kind of business can I build for my niche studies? For example, I want to figure out in Cleveland, Ohio, how to make it so that people actually get to their appointments at the food bank. So it could be that a startup comes to a company like Streetlight. It doesn't have to be Streetlight, but comes to Streetlight and says, I want to license your metrics, put them into my platform to solve this particular type of societally important use case.
Good answer. Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple more here. This is more with respect to the way Streetlight handles the input data. I don't know if we ever talked about this, but have you thought or considered the idea of using a virtual clean room for some of the input data?
We have considered using a virtual clean room. I think that there are some challenges in, okay, that virtual clean room, is that a Streetlight company? Is that a joint venture with another company? And what are the mechanisms for actually getting from the supplier materials into clean room and then into what Streetlight wants to do?
Cool. I think I can sneak one more question in, and that is a little self-serving, but have you looked at delivery mechanisms around digital twins? This seems to be the year for people to get excited about digital twins, and
Mhm.
RBC is no exception there. Have you looked at that as a possibility?
Well, I cannot answer that question on behalf of Streetlight because I do not know the answer. But I am happy to find out for you, Arthur, and for the rest of the audience.
Very cool. Very cool. I think we might pause it there, Kara. Let you relax for a little bit and enjoy the last session here. But thanks so much for the presentation, and I can tell from the audience reaction that was very successful. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.